Glass shattered so loud it slapped the room through the earpiece, and the mother's voice hit me like a freight train before I even saw the address on my screen. "Please send an ambulance, he's losing so much blood," she sobbed, and I felt my hands go cold then move like they belonged to someone else, typing the dispatch code without thinking. I could hear the boy in the background, a small, muffled sound that made my chest tighten, and I told her, "Stay with me, I'm sending help," even as my cursor slid toward the send button. Then Tyler Morgan, my supervisor, rolled his chair up behind me like he owned the air in the room and put his fingers on the keyboard. He didn't whisper, he typed a code out loud enough that the mother heard it through my headset. The screen froze. My console flashed an administrative lock and my throat went dry. Tyler leaned over my shoulder, glanced at the neighborhood name on my display, and smirked like he'd just caught me in a trick. "Can't send anything there," he said, loud and clear. "We keep units for Crestview Heights tonight. Donors and guests might need us more." He said it like the decision was simple math. The mother, Monique, she told me her name between sobs, started begging harder, telling me her toddler had fallen through a broken window and wouldn't open his eyes. I jabbed at the keys, pulled up alternate units, tried to ping mutual aid, anything. The lock wouldn't let me. Tyler didn't leave it at words. He pulled a laptop from his bag and clicked like a surgeon routing ambulances away from that block with cold, practiced motions. I watched routing messages flip from green to red on my screen and my stomach rolled into knots I couldn't swallow. "Please," Monique said. "He's getting cold, he's not breathing right." She counted breaths aloud like a prayer I couldn't answer. Then Tyler unplugged the emergency desk phone and holding the cord said it aloud like an announcement at a funeral. 17 minutes. He twirled the cord in his hand like it was a leash. I stared at him, the cord, his expression, and at the headset where the mother kept talking, her voice thin and frantic. The world narrowed to three things: her voice, the lock on my screen, and that goddamn cord in his hand. I felt helpless in a way I never had in my life. All the training etched into my shoulders meant nothing when someone could simply take access away and say it was for the greater good. My mind raced through protocols. Override codes, emergency release, paging the on-duty chief, everything I could do required clearance I didn't have when a supervisor held a lock. I said into the headset, "I'm getting units, ma'am. Stay on the line and tell me exactly where you are in the apartment." She told me the building number, the floor, the broken window, the boy's name, how he wouldn't open his eyes. I relayed every word I could think to say that might help a neighbor or passerby understand what to do in that moment. I told her, "Try to keep him warm, apply pressure to the wound. Don't move him if you suspect spinal injury," even though what she kept describing sounded like massive blood loss. Tyler's clicks were methodical, almost bored, and he announced each reroute like he was giving a weather report. Unit 3 redirected to Crestview, Unit 5 held. He didn't try to hide the satisfaction in his voice. I could hear the mother counting the boy's breaths, a tiny, frightened rhythm she clung to like a rope. 2, 3, 4, she counted, and each number hit me harder than the last. I tried to call the backup supervisor, but Tyler had unplugged the desk line. My cell sat on the desk beside me, buzzing with messages I couldn't send because the administrative lock killed outbound dispatch permissions too. I tried the emergency release on the console, the one you're supposed to push when a life is in immediate danger and a supervisor is making the wrong call. It asked for credentials I didn't have. Tyler watched me like he was reading the last page of a book he'd already finished. He said, "Systems honoring admin override. It times out in 17 minutes, then you can play hero." He sounded smug, like someone punishing a child for asking for dinner. My hands hovered over the keyboard and then clenched, and the mother kept counting, each breath a soft, terrifying drumbeat in my ear. I felt utterly trapped, listening to the sound of a child and knowing I was the one person who could have sent help if not for a man deciding who deserved it. 5 minutes in, and Monique's screams had become a thin, strained whisper as she pressed towels to the wound, trying to keep any blood from soaking through like that would somehow buy time. I watched the pulse line on my screen like it was the only honest thing left, and Tyler sat back in his chair and pulled his phone out like he'd earned a break. He scrolled and laughed at videos between hitting reject on my dispatch attempts, saying, loud enough for the headset to pick up, "Babies bleed all the time, it's probably a scrape." He said it like that made him a doctor, like that wiped away the bleeding and the fear. I tried every shortcut in the system, every backup protocol I knew by heart, fingers moving faster than my brain could follow, but each path hit a wall. I reached for the emergency desk phone by reflex and found its cord dangling from the counter where Tyler had ripped it free, and he held it in his other hand like a trophy. "No unauthorized calls," he said, smirking as if he'd taught me a lesson. The console mocked me with an administrative lock banner that wouldn't budge. My throat tightened so much I had to swallow air hard to keep from shouting. Through the headset, Monique was getting quieter, telling me the boy's skin was cold and limp, her voice breaking over every syllable. She kept repeating his name like saying it might wake him, and I kept saying, "Hold on, ma'am, help's coming," even though the system wouldn't let me actually send anyone. I tried to think of other ways to get resources there. Call neighboring dispatch, alert fire, call for mutual aid by manual radio. But each option needed an authorization level Tyler was clearly blocking. He clicked and rerouted units to Crestview like he was moving chess pieces off a board, and every time I tried to override he looked up and grinned, like he was watching me fail intentionally. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. Then a new voice came into my ear, strong and rough with years behind it, the neighbor Vietnam veteran. He didn't waste time with hesitation or questions. I heard doors slam, footsteps, and then the veteran's voice firm and calm saying, "Get the towels, hold his neck, clear the airway." He assessed the boy and started chest compressions right away, counting out loud in a steady rhythm I could hear through the headset. 1, 2, 3, 4, he counted, and the numbers sounded almost like a lifeline. I started to say the address again, over and over, but Tyler kept rejecting the dispatches as if to punctuate each count. Listening to the veteran work, I felt something else kick in besides panic, anger. This man knew hemorrhagic shock when he saw it. He knew that the boy needed blood and airway control immediately. I typed everything I could think of into the chat window: suspected hemorrhagic shock, need tourniquet, airway clearing, hoping that a neighbor or passerby might see it on a shared screen or that another dispatcher would pick up what I was trying to send. My messages sat in limbo. Tyler tapped his phone and said, "You're wasting CPU cycles," like that would make my hands obey his will. In between compressions, I could hear the veteran barking commands to Monique, forcing her to do simple things like press harder on the wound and wrap towels tighter. She obeyed like a puppet pulled by fear. I mouthed the words into the headset, "Help is on the way," over and over, even though inside I knew we were trapped in a time trap because someone decided which lives mattered more. My mouth formed the sentence, because saying it felt like the only thing I could control that didn't get blocked by a code or a smug supervisor. Tyler kept clicking rejects like he was undoing hope in real time, and at one point he leaned in and said, "We're prioritizing risk. Donors in Crestview outweigh unknowns in that block." He delivered that line clinically, like policy, like law. I could hear the veteran counting compressions, the numbers like a clock I wasn't allowed to stop. My hands shook so badly I almost hit the wrong keys. Instead, I started copying text logs to a thumb drive and took screenshots with a camera I kept in my drawer for odd reasons. I knew then that I had to get proof of what he was doing, even if I couldn't get the ambulance out in time. Every minute felt like an hour. The headset made Monique's breathing sound closer than the others in the room. She kept saying, "Please," over and over, and the veteran's counts carried on like a metronome of desperation. Tyler's gaze flicked between me and the phone, and I felt a bile-deep disgust at how casual he was about rerouting life-saving help. I kept talking to Monique because someone had to be with her voice, because silence would mean surrender, because lying about help coming felt like a small crime compared to what was already happening. I mouthed, "Hang on," even as the system stayed locked and the clock kept moving toward an impossible 17 minutes. At minute 12, I lunged for the second console like a man trying to grab a lifeline off a sinking ship, because I couldn't stand there and let a kid die because someone liked the look of a neighborhood. Tyler moved faster than I expected and tackled me hard enough that the wheels on our chairs screamed against the linoleum and we crashed into the desk. He pinned my arms while still typing one-handed, like he wanted to make sure the job got done even while he punished me for trying. The others in the room watched like statues, eyes fixed on screens or the clock, not daring to breathe. I remember thinking how ridiculous it looked, two grown men wrestling over cables and keyboards, while 12 blocks away a veteran was compressing a child's chest with the steady rhythm of someone who knew what real urgency felt like. My face was hot, my vision narrowed, and every training drill they stuffed into me came back useless because the system had been stolen with one smooth override. I could hear Tyler's fingers hit keys, the little clicks loud as gunshots in my ears, and I could hear the mother begging in the headset like a thin thread trying not to break. Then the daughter, 7-year-old, came on, her voice small and breaking like a twig. "Is he going to heaven?" she asked, and the room narrowed until the only thing in it was that question. It was clean and terrible, the kind of question that leaves you stupid and raw and furious. I felt something inside me give way. Everything that had been fear and training turned into a blunt single thing: get the help there. I bit Tyler's hand. I didn't think about consequences or whether I'd get in trouble. I bit him hard enough to feel his skin tear, and I tasted metal and sweat and knew I had drawn blood. He yelped, and that split second gave me a chance to snatch at his laptop. My fingers flew and I slammed the send key like a man who'd been holding his breath for too long. I heard the dispatch go through with a tiny confirmation pop in my ear. I imagined paramedics starting their engines. I imagined the old man keeping compressions until help arrived. For the first time in what felt like an age, hope flared inside me like a small, reckless fire. Then Tyler slammed the laptop down on my fingers with a thud so hard it sent shock through my hand. Pain shot up and white spots danced across my vision, and before I could even curse, he reached into his drawer, produced a small black device and held it up like a trophy. He called it out, almost proud, signal jammer. Keeps what we don't want from getting out. He pressed it against his chest, grandstanding like a villain in a bad movie, then leaned in and drove his forearm into my throat until the world turned sharp and oxygenless. I couldn't breathe. For a terrifying second I was drowning on dry air, my head ringing and my ears full of everything and nothing all at once. I couldn't shout the address. I couldn't shout any of the dozen things I wanted to say that would make someone pick up and run. My hands scraped uselessly against his arm, my lungs burning, and the headset kept feeding me the mother's voice, thinner now, and the veteran counting compressions, steady as a heartbeat. I mouthed the address into the microphone with my lips trembling, but the sound came out like a dead whisper that no one could hear. Tyler's grip wasn't the rough choke that kills, it was calculated. He kept me on the edge of being able to speak, but not enough to be useful. It was like he wanted me to understand the power he had, to show me that he could decide who got help and who didn't. The jammer hummed in the background and screens around us flickered as if reacting to some invisible pressure on the air. My cell buzzed and died, the desk phones were dead. The console I had just fired a dispatch from sat there with a brief history line that would probably vanish when he needed it to. All around us people pretended not to see. Nobody jumped up to help. Nobody reached for the drawer where Tyler kept the jammer, even though plenty of us knew it was illegal and dangerous. My chest flattened under his forearm and I felt every second like a small hammer. I knew in that moment that someone had the power to stop a rescue and was using it like a toy. I also knew that if I didn't break free then whatever momentum I had managed might be crushed forever. I bit him again, not because I wanted to hurt him more, but because I couldn't trust anything else to buy me another second. He cursed and pushed harder, and this time my knuckles grazed the edge of a metal bracket and bled. The taste of iron in my mouth was everywhere. I hit the send key with my thumb as hard as I could and felt the tiny click through my palm. The console registered the orders, and I watched the little confirmation pop up with my stare because that was all I could do. Watch and hope and hold on until whatever came next happened. When Tyler's forced lock finally blinked out right on the 17-minute mark, I hit every dispatch key like a madman and sent 3 ambulances and a med helicopter to that apartment. I don't know if I prayed before that moment, but I prayed then like a man with nothing else to offer, short, ugly prayers that sounded like breath. The confirmation tones came through and I felt a small, stupid burst of relief, like someone had handed me an oxygen mask. I watched the icons change, engines start, and I listened to my own voice tell Monique, "Help is on the way," with the kind of conviction I needed to fake until I believed it. Within minutes, the units were on scene. I heard shouts on the open line and the veteran telling someone to move, while metal and boots and equipment clattered. Through that static, the mother's wail came like a freight train finally allowed to run, a raw sound of relief edged with a new, deeper terror. I sat with the headset off one ear, sweating and shaking, and felt both grateful and sick in the same instant. I knew paramedics had reached the child, but what they'd find and what had already happened wasn't under my control. I could only listen and hope every second I'd bought from Tyler's arrogance had made a difference. When the medics reported back over a secured line, they used calm, clipped language that tried to hide how bad things were. They said massive blood loss and suspected intracranial hemorrhage and words like that trained me to imagine the worst. They told me he was alive but barely, and they were taking him to the trauma center immediately. My hands went numb and then cold. The room around me felt unreal. I kept replaying the jumbled timeline in my head. Glass, fall, towels, compressions, 17 minutes of nothing while Tyler played with his toys. I wrote everything down on a yellow pad, the handwriting shaky and angry because I needed a map from chaos to truth. Once the immediate emergency thread ended and the dispatch floor quieted to its normal hum, I started digging into what had happened the way a man scratches at a scab until it bleeds. I pulled logs, cross-checked timestamps, and looked at routing decisions like someone reading a confession written in code. The ambulance ETAs that Tyler had rerouted were reroutes to Crestview, logged literally as risk management prioritization. My stomach dropped when I matched those reroutes to the timeline of the child's fall. There was no mistake, no misclick. Someone had ordered units away from a bleeding child on purpose. The hospital called the next day. The voice on the other end was clinical and horrible in its detail. Doctor said the boy had survived the initial bleed but with catastrophic brain injury from prolonged hypoxia. They described damage to the prefrontal cortex and extensive repair that wouldn't restore speech. They explained, gently and cruelly, that his cognitive and physical recovery would be partial at best and come with lifetime care. I wrote down words that would haunt me: survived, severe disability, nonverbal, and long-term care. Those terms felt like a verdict handed down in a closed room where I couldn't appeal. I kept thinking about the medical bills like a physical weight. The hospital estimated emergency surgeries, ICU time, rehab, and round-the-clock care costs that would swallow any average family's life savings and then some. Monique's voice over the next calls was smaller, flattened around the edges by worry and paperwork and grief. She asked me questions that weren't about medical terms so much as how to keep a roof and a payment plan. She asked what resources were available and whether the city had any help. I tried to be honest and helpful, handing her phone numbers and names of legal aid clinics while my head spun with the knowledge that none of that would fix a boy who could no longer speak. Even as the medics worked and the mother tried to hold together a life unraveling faster than she could knit it back, my thoughts kept looping to Tyler's hands on the keyboard and his face when he announced the lock. I thought of him holding the unplugged phone cord like a leash and the way he smirked while watching a jerk show or some nonsense on his screen. The deliberate nature of his acts made my stomach sick. The reroutes, the jammer, the way he timed it to the party in Crestview like it was a chess move. If proof existed, it would be in those logs, the vendor records, purchase orders, and in the chat history that showed rejects timed exactly with Monique's breaths. So while paramedics stabilized a child and surgeons worked to stop bleeding and save what brain they could, I started the work I should have done sooner: collecting evidence. I copied logs, took screenshots, saved voicemail timestamps, and backed up chat history to multiple drives. I jotted down every name of every unit that had been rerouted and when, and I wrote a short, precise account of the 17 minutes in my own hand. I needed something that would stand up when someone tried to claim policy or prioritization instead of deliberate neglect. I needed proof that a man had chosen a party and donors over a bleeding child in a stranger's apartment. I didn't know if proving it would bring the child back or pay the bills, but I knew it might stop the next time Tyler did it. That possibility kept me working late into the night, the dispatch room empty, my screen blue with logs, and my heart raw and furious under everything I wrote. I promised myself I wouldn't let this be a single day's horror that got filed away. I would push for the truth, even if that push cost me everything else I had left. I tried to file an immediate complaint the morning after the call because my hands were still shaking and I couldn't sleep, and the thought of that little boy kept looping in my head. I walked into HR and told them everything I could remember, words tripping over each other, and I handed over the screenshots and timestamps I had burned onto a thumb drive. Zara Blake, the HR manager, listened with a calm face that didn't tell me what she thought, and then she told me plain and formal that they needed proof. She said the same thing the manual said: documentation, logs, vendor backups. Her words landed like a polite wall. Zara explained the system's data retention policy like it was just another checkbox. Supervisor override logs were set to auto-purge after 36 hours as a privacy protection. She called it a standard practice, something to protect people's admin privileges and keep the database lean. I felt my stomach drop because the way it sounded in the manual was the same way a murderer explains why he locked the door: neutral, practiced, and final. When I asked if they could freeze the logs, she said she couldn't do that without vendor cooperation and a formal internal request, and there was always a chain of approvals that took time. Time, I realized, was exactly what Tyler had bought with his smug grin and his jammer. A few coworkers pulled me aside afterward like we were sharing a rumor in a war zone. They spoke in low tones and looked at the floor when they said Tyler had done this before. One said he'd rerouted units away from an encampment of homeless people during a snowstorm. Another whispered about a midnight denial near the shelters that had delayed treatment for an overdosed man. The throughline was ugly and simple. The override seemed to target low-income blocks and places where donors didn't live. Those small confirmations were the kind of thing that builds an ugly pattern if you can gather enough of them. And the pattern started to look like policy by stealth. That night while I sat at my kitchen table and tried to calm my hands, my phone buzzed. It was Tyler. He'd sent me a text that read, blunt and thin: delete the lunch recording or get fired and lose your certification. I had recorded him earlier when he bragged about redirecting calls while laughing with other supervisors. His message felt like a threat with a legal edge. I panicked in a way that was both childish and practical. I saw my career vanish and felt the weight of the city's certification board over everything I owned. For hours I sat and stared at the screen, thinking about how fast a few files could disappear and how simple it would be for an accusation to become my entire life. Then I stopped panicking and started preparing. I copied the recording to 3 separate cloud accounts with different providers because redundancy felt like sanity. I put duplicates on 2 physical USB drives and locked them in a metal box I kept for important paperwork. I printed out every log I could, photographed every screen with a camera I hadn't used since a wedding, and labeled each image with the date and time. My hands moved like they belonged to someone who was building a lifeboat out of whatever driftwood he could find. I wanted more than copies. I wanted a trail that showed the wrongdoing couldn't be erased with a single purge. I called coworker Jeremy Cole because he hated the override system too, and because we'd once joked about how easy it was to lose evidence in the system. Jeremy picked up the way someone who knew this could be dangerous but also knew it had to be done. He agreed to try and pull screenshots from the vendor's backup archive before the 36-hour window closed. We talked in clipped sentences about access permissions, timestamps, and legal safe harbors. He warned me that the vendor often required a formal subpoena or an investigator to hand over long-term backups, but Jeremy knew people at the vendor who owed him favors. His voice had a steady edge that night. He sounded like a man who'd been shoved into a corner and decided he'd fight. As we planned, I documented everything we did. I wrote a detailed timeline from the glass breaking to the moment Tyler's override expired. I sketched how the reroutes lined up with the party in Crestview and noted the units that had been redirected. I saved the text message Tyler sent me and took screenshots of his brag about owning a signal jammer. I also recorded the coworkers' whispered confirmations, turning their stories into notes with times and names. It felt like putting nails into a board, so the story couldn't be brushed away as bad memory or miscommunication. By morning, I had nearly a full chain of evidence ready to move to someone who could act, but I also knew HR would push back, and that Tyler might try to purge anything he still could. I arranged to meet a local investigative reporter anonymously and to get Jeremy to request the vendor backups in a way that started an official paper trail. I didn't know if this would end in my job or my certification, but I understood then that proof was the only weapon I had that could turn a single bad night into a public fight. I decided I would not let the city quietly bury this under policy language and purges. I woke up to a text telling me HR had put me on paid administrative leave, and my world tilted into a different kind of quiet where every phone buzz felt like a threat. I went into the office because I couldn't sit at home while paperwork swam around my life, and Zara Blake, HR manager, met me in a small conference room with that calm corporate voice that tries to hold a lid on panic. She told me they were protecting me by putting me on leave, but then warned me, soft and precise, about unauthorized recordings and chain-of-command violations like she was reading from a manual written to protect the institution before people. I told her the reasons anyway, facts clipped and measured because adrenaline didn't know how to stop. She asked for documentation and suggested I let HR handle the investigation. I watched her pen hover over a folder like a judge deciding how loud she wanted to be. She kept circling the word protocol, and when I mentioned Tyler's text telling me to delete the footage, her face didn't change. She said she had to follow procedure and that any overt moves could complicate things legally. Her calmness felt like a wall between me and the truth I needed to expose. Heather Green, union representative, sat with me next and slid a stack of complaint forms across the table like they were trapdoors under a hallway of suits. She handed me the pen and watched me sign forms that might save me or bury me in red tape. Her voice had a softer edge, a practical warmth that felt like armor. Heather told me how to file each complaint and warned about delays. Bureaucracy can be a weapon, she said. She explained the union's steps and how to keep a paper trail, but also how the city could slow things down until memory faded or logs vanished. Her warning landed hard because she'd seen this kind of stall before. I called Jeremy Cole, coworker, that afternoon, and we spoke in low tones about vendor archives and access. Jeremy had always been the kind of guy who noticed odd things in the system, and he sounded guarded when he confirmed what I feared. The vendor's longer-term backups might hold the override logs HR claimed expired. He explained that the city's retention policy wasn't just a policy but a vulnerability Tyler had exploited. Jeremy suggested we ask the vendor for a rapid pull, but he knew that formally requesting it would let Tyler and HR know we were pursing proof. He wanted a way to quietly secure the data before anything else could be scrubbed. I contacted Daniel Price, investigative reporter, anonymously late that night because I needed someone who could push faster than HR and would understand this wasn't just a single bad actor, but a system that allowed bad actors to act. Daniel asked for documentation and witnesses in the blunt way of someone who deals in proofs and stories that change policy. He promised to look into procurement orders, override histories, and to talk to sources who might not trust the city to investigate itself. His questions were surgical and precise, the kind of heat I needed on this. As pieces began to fall into place, Jeremy told me quietly about procurement entries that looked like nothing. Communications gear or network maintenance orders that in reality matched the cost and description of signal jammers and other suppression tools. He said Tyler and maybe others had misclassified purchases to hide them in plain sight, the way someone keeps a crime disguised in accounting code. We compared notes, timestamps on purchases, approximate delivery dates, and who had access. The pattern looked deliberate, not accidental, and each tiny fact tightened the net around what Tyler had done. I filed my formal complaints with Heather's help and asked the union to escalate quickly because time and the vendor purge policy threatened the whole case. Heather warned me again about retaliation and told me how to document any new threats. I saved every message Tyler sent, every smug text, and placed copies in multiple cloud accounts and with people I trusted. The legal forms were in, the union had my back on filings, Jeremy was working on vendor-side access quietly, and the reporter had a thread to follow. It felt like a crooked, fragile thing, proof strung together by worry and urgency, but it was something. At night I lay awake replaying the mother's voice and the little girl asking if her brother was going to heaven, and those sounds were the fuel behind every move I made the next day. The office had become a chessboard, and we were finally moving pieces, not just reacting to Tyler's next sweep. I knew this wasn't just about revenge or my job. It was about making sure the city couldn't prioritize parties over people without someone calling it out. The pieces were lining up, messy and imperfect, but real enough that the next steps might finally force the city to look at what it had let happen. I kept pushing the trail like a man chasing a loose end that could never rest until it was tied, because the mother's voice kept replaying in my head and wouldn't let me forget why I was doing this. Miranda Bell, whistleblower attorney, agreed to take my case through the union legal aid program, and she moved fast. She showed me how to preserve evidence to make it bulletproof. Chain of custody notes, notarized backups, and timestamps. She helped draft the official whistleblower paperwork and told me exactly how to log threats. Her tone was steady but urgent, and she made me read back every call I had recorded so we could document the supervisors who called and warned me I'd ruin my career. Those calls were cold, thin warnings, voices saying things like, "You shouldn't poke this hornet's nest, kid, and think about your certification," and Miranda told me to save them all. Jeremy and I kept digging into procurement and vendor records like two guys with a flashlight under a porch. We pulled screenshots of purchase orders that showed a communications device billed to the dispatch department and signed off by department heads who probably glanced at a line or two. The invoice matched the specs and price of the jammer Tyler had shown me, and the delivery dates lined up with other nights he'd used overrides. The signatures were there, neat and official, and the approval chain read like a bureaucratic map that could be followed to find who knew what and when. Jeremy whispered, "They misclassified it on purpose," and that was all the push I needed to keep going. Chad Price, reporter, published the first piece using anonymous sources and the leaked logs we fed him. He ran the story with the logs and the basic timeline, and the city had to respond in words that sounded rehearsed. The public reaction was immediate and loud. People were furious in the streets and on social media because this wasn't just a dispatch problem, this was life and death. I got emails from neighbors who said they'd seen ambulances diverted before, from a pastor who said his congregation had worried about this for years, and from a woman who said her mother had waited in an ambulance for help that never came. The anger made the city's official denials ring hollow. They answered with memos and forms and talk about internal reviews, which only set people angrier because their words felt like delays. Under pressure, the Oversight Committee called for a public hearing and ordered an independent audit of override procedures. They made that call faster than I expected, probably because the paper and the crowd had shoved the issue into clear light. I prepared to speak like a man whose hands were still shaking from that night. Miranda told me to be precise, to stick to facts, and to cue the recording I had of Tyler. She said, "Play it. Let the room hear what we can't let slide." I cued the file and took a breath I didn't feel steady enough to hold. The hearing room was packed. Community members filled every seat and cameras tracked the room like hungry eyes. When I went up to the microphone, my palms were slick and I could hear the click of my own pulse. I introduced myself, and then, because I wanted no room for doubt, I said, "This is a recording of my supervisor Tyler Morgan during the incident. I hit play. Tyler's voice came out of the speakers thin and laughing, the sound of a man who thought he was clever. He said we keep units for Crestview, babies bleed all the time, as if he were telling a joke. The room changed at that line, conversations stopped, the air tightened. A gasp spread through the packed room like a wave. You could feel people move closer to the edge of their chairs as if the sound had been the punchline to something they had suspected but never heard admitted. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands and started to cry. Members of the committee traded looks that read like, "This can't be what it sounds like," and then slower, "It is what it sounds like." The recording had weight in a way my words alone could not, and it forced the issue from suspicion to public fact. After the hearing, the committee voted to order an independent audit and to freeze supervisor override privileges until they could review policies and retention settings. They demanded vendor cooperation for archived logs and procurement records, and they scheduled follow-up sessions. It wasn't justice in the full sense, not yet, but it was a start. People thanked me in the hallway, thanks that felt like currency I hadn't known I needed. Miranda told me to be prepared for retaliation, and Jeremy warned me the next steps would turn ugly. But for a moment after the recording played and the room shifted, I felt like the mother's voice had been heard in a place that could force change. The audit would look for patterns, and the committee had to answer for how much power a single supervisor had. The city could still close ranks, but the public hearing had opened a door that couldn't be closed easily. I left that room raw and unsettled and more certain than before that I had done the right thing, even if it cost me everything. I remember the day the audit came back like a verdict on the whole rotten setup, and the numbers were ugly and exact enough to make people shift in their chairs. The independent review showed a pattern. Poorer neighborhoods were delayed by an average of 14 minutes during override incidents, and dozens of supervisor overrides looked like they were aimed at low-income blocks. It wasn't just one bad night. It was a system that let a supervisor pick and choose who got help. When the report dropped, the city could no longer hide behind polite denials and slow memos. The Oversight Committee forced policy changes that felt like small victories after a long fight. Any denial now needed 2 supervisors to agree before an override could lock a console, and log retention got extended to 5 years so nothing could be wiped away in a day. They also ordered vendor cooperation and financial audits of those misclassified purchases. It wasn't full accountability, but it added real guardrails to stop single men from deciding who lived. Tyler Morgan was taken off active duty and put on administrative leave, then reassigned away from dispatch roles that had power to reroute help. There were no criminal charges, which left a sour taste in my mouth, and a lot of folks in the neighborhood said justice felt partial. Still, the changes meant other families might not face the same cruel delay if a supervisor decided a party mattered more than a child. That knowledge kept me from wanting to burn down everything in anger. The city offered me a resignation deal that was meant to close the chapter quietly. Neutral terms, forgiveness of public disputes, and a push to drop the certification fight. I talked it over with Miranda Bell, whistleblower attorney, and we decided to negotiate. I pushed for benefits through the year and some limited severance so I could breathe and plan without couch surfing. Miranda helped me frame the terms to protect my certification enough to work later and to keep some financial breathing room. I signed the resignation because I wanted to keep a lid on further harm to my family and avoid a long, draining legal war I might still lose. Leaving the city job tore me up, my career in that dispatch center, the friends who turned away, and a nest egg that drained faster than I'd planned. But I left with a few protections and a clear conscience. I also kept my voice loud enough to push the city to change procedures so one supervisor couldn't lock out help again. After that, I didn't sit quiet. I started teaching free first aid classes in the neighborhood that had been hurt the most because I couldn't sit on the sidelines while people waited for help and felt powerless. I taught people how to apply pressure, how to check airways, how to keep a child warm while waiting for help, and how to document emergencies. The classes filled with neighbors, family members, and folks who wanted to be ready if the system failed them again. I wanted those small skills to be the difference someone could make before professional help arrived. I visited Monique's mother and her son in the hospital many times. The boy had severe brain injury that left him mostly nonverbal, but he learned tiny ways to show recognition. A squeeze of a hand, a flutter in his eyes when a certain song played, or a slow smile when Monique told him a story. Those small moments felt like miracles after the long, awful beginning. Monique signed paperwork with legal aid help and fought for coverage and care, and she showed a stubborn grace that made me proud to have stood up for her family. When my suspension ended, I took a lower-paying dispatch job 2 hours north because I wanted to keep doing the work I knew and to be somewhere my conscience could survive. The cost had been high. Lost income, strained friendships, and a kind of sleep that never quite came back. But speaking up triggered reforms that might stop another dispatcher from deciding who would live and who would wait. That truth kept me going when the bills stacked up and the nights still woke me. I learned that doing the right thing often feels like losing, but sometimes that loss changes the system enough that other people get a fairer shot. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.